This is a presentation about the subject area of history. It centers on the following. To what extent can we say that there is historical truth, and what type of evidence is required for something to be considered historical truth? The significance of the topic. What has transpired in the past is important for us to understand. By studying where we came from, we hope to understand ourselves better and learn from previous mistakes. This is also seen in the quote by William Lund. We study the past to understand the present. We understand the present to guide the future. Absolute truth in history is a goal we ideally want to attain. If history was extremely fictitious, then it would not have the same effect on us with regards to learning from it. In other words, understanding the real experiences of people prior to us intrigues us more so than any rendition of fiction could. This is perhaps due to an innate emotional appeal. Also, a note about this presentation, it is focused on human history. So, what exactly is meant by historical truth? Well, the term pertains to something, it pertains objectively to the event that took place. And furthermore, ideally, historical truth is verified by complete and accurate primary and secondary sources. Or it is. This is what encompasses historical truth. And also, ideally, we know, through historical truth, we know the complete and objective answers to the questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how about the event that occurred. So we begin by trying to locate examples of historical truth and possible problems that are associated with it. Some examples of historical truth can be the dates and places of events that happened in recent memory. Take, for example, the US invasion of Iraq. It can be considered objective historical truth on the exact date when they landed, because this usually will not require interpretation. It could be accepted by everyone. However, it could be hard to pinpoint exact dates of events that happened very long ago, and records may not exist or may be incomplete. An event could be the date of the birth of Shakespeare. Aside from dates, places, and outcomes, the main problems in history arise when historians try to answer why or how an event happened, as this requires interpretation, which can differ between historians. This gives rise to the question, can there be historical truth, aside from most dates, places, etc., regarding why and how an event took place? So here's an example of a problem in finding historical truth. Take, for instance, the extent of England's rate of economic growth during the Industrial Revolution. And here are some of the changes of interpretation of this event through time. First, data partly based on the wages of craftsmen, which was compiled in the 50s and 60s, it suggested massive economic growth. Then, however, estimates of growth rates were revised down by Dean and Cole historians, largely on the basis of alternative data stemming from research into GDP and national wages. Then, in the mid-1980s, there was even more drastic of a downward estimate of the extent of growth during the Industrial Revolution, so much so that the term revolution was questioned by Crafts and Harley. Eventually, all of these revisions were challenged by historians such as Berg and Hudson, who questioned the compiled data, the newly compiled data. And what their argument was that the Industrial Revolution was a regional development, and therefore it was hard to study through national aggregate statistics. So the problem in the previous example, there were different types of evidence that were used to try and gauge the extent of economic growth. New research providing evidence challenged and even threatened to replace the old. And here, one has to decide which evidence is better to use, which evidence will lead to a better answer. And of course, this is a subjective issue. Not only that, but approaching the issue from a different perspective, such as the one that stated the industrial region was a region, that the industrial revolution was a regional development and hard to measure through national stats, it changes the argument, because now evidence may have to be reinterpreted and new evidence may have to be found from regional areas to see the extent of the revolution there and the effect of it. In addition, it can be very hard to come up with an accurate interpretation of statistics, especially when you are not in the historical context of the event. Just because two things are correlated with each other does not mean they are necessarily related. For instance, in Africa there is a correlation between the increase of the number of people with AIDS and the decrease of population of elephants, and yet there is no relationship between the two in terms of cause and effect. Some ways historians interpret evidence. First of all, we have reason. And if a particular event takes place, then historians try to piece together potential cause and effect from other evidence and likelihood of the event in the historical context. Sense perception is used for the interpretation of photo and video sources. And interpreting the events of history and the causation and effect of using emotional language is more risky in the sense that it runs risk of personal bias more so than the previous two ways of knowing. Furthermore, issues with interpretation of evidence includes the bias and even the ideology of this historian, as well as the evidence used, such as where they could be vague or inaccurate. The primary and secondary sources may be incomplete themselves. So the two main problems here are not only the historians and their interpretation, but the evidence itself and its completeness and accuracy. Here's an example of problems with primary sources. Take, for instance, the Ukrainian famine, 1932 to 33. So during this time period, Western nations refused to believe in the famine, and as a result, from this time period, any primary sources from the West will run the risk of having bias and or inaccuracy. For instance, Walter Duranty of New York Times repeatedly denied the existence of the famine, and then he received the Pulitzer Prize for accuracy in reporting. Privately, however, he estimated that as many as 10 million people died in the famine. And then there was another man, Malcolm Muggeridge, who defied Soviet authorities, and he reported accurately on the famine, and yet he was not believed by the people of the West. Why? Because they did not want to tarnish their relations with the Soviet Union. So this shows how historical context and primary sources can be factors in the evidence historians gained, because the primary sources themselves can have problems which historical context can influence and lead to inaccuracy